Hi, everyone. Welcome to another episode of the LATAM Stocks Podcast. I'm your host, Patrick Flood. Today, I'm here with Dr. John Welch. John's had a long career working with Latin America. He's been a managing director and chief economist at several major financial institutions. He currently has his own consulting and advisory service, Research for Emerging Markets, REM. So I'm really excited to talk to John today about several of the markets in Latin America and what he's seeing. So let's get right into it. Hi, John. Thank you so much for doing this.
No, thank you for inviting me. I appreciate it.
So I'm excited to talk to you. Maybe can we just hear a little bit more about your background before we start going into the market stuff?
Well, I'm also currently a professor at St. Petersburg College and also at Universidade Presbiteriana Mackenzie in Brazil. And I'm doing work. I'm on a project with the Fundação Getúlio Cabral in Brazil as well. So I'm fairly busy, which is good. My background is I grew up in Brazil. I moved there when I was 10. I came back for high school, went back. My father went back down after I graduated. So I was always in Brazil for at least 3 months a year. Then I went to undergrad at Columbia and I wanted to do Brazil. So I went to the University of Illinois to work with Werner Bayer. And I got a Fulbright Hays to go down. I wrote my dissertation on Brazilian financial development and rewrote it so normal people can read it and publish it as a book. I had already started working on the other countries, Argentina, Mexico, and then I moved forward from there. I was an academic for a number of years, first at Oakland University, then the University of North Texas and University of Texas, Austin. And then I was at the Dallas Fed for 3 years, where Bill Grubin and I created a Center for Latin American Economics. And then Wall Street called, so I went to Wall Street. And I've covered pretty much almost all countries, major countries, certainly in Latin America, and some countries in the Caribbean.
So tell me a little bit more about the classes you teach. I saw that. It's kind of unique. You teach in both countries. So what do you teach? Is it undergrad? Is it economics?
Undergrad.
Finance?
It's actually, I taught at Columbia, also as an adjunct at King's College at NYU. But it's a 4-year college. It's very big. They have 5 campuses. And it's a blast. I'm really enjoying it. It's Econ 101, introductory, macro, introductory, micro. And it's good. Everyone's motivated. And that's good. As long as people want to learn, I'm there.
Awesome. So tell me a little more about the research firm then. What type of research do you provide to clients? What markets and asset classes do you focus on most often?
Well, mine is macro. So, and in my career, I always focused on forecasting, GDP, fiscal accounts, inflation, what the central bank was going to do. And sometimes I did strategy. Sometimes I worked with a strategist. And you always closely work with strategists, whether they were in my group or not. So my first boss, a guy named Ken Teljohn at Lehman Brothers, gave me very good advice. He said, don't write anything unless you have an actionable conclusion. So I worked in fixed income most of the time, but I have worked for equities. It was for the top-down clients. I worked for the equity side at Lehman and at Paribas, a little bit at CIBC. At HSBC, I certainly did. At Banco Itaù in Brazil, I worked both the treasury and the private bank. So I've sort of been all over the place, but I didn't have my main focus is foreign exchange and fixed income and rates.
Great. So we talked a little bit before we got on about the foreign exchange in Argentina. You mentioned you were working on a piece about the peso. So let's talk about Argentina. I mean, in your view, what's the current state of Argentina's economy? What happened over the last
in transition, right? They had a lot of people, especially in Brazil. The Brazilian economists didn't live through the last one, which I did, with Domingo Cavallo and the Conversibilidade convertibility plan. And they said, well, they just don't have enough reserves. And so I haven't published it, written a piece to say, no, that's not the case. They have plenty. And in this case, yes, their net reserves, well, they're starting to get positive. They're starting to gain reserves. But you just have to pick the exchange rate where the assets, the gross dollar assets of the central bank cover completely the monetary liabilities and bond liabilities of the central bank. Turns out with now they're up to $22.5 billion in dollars, that exchange rate is about 835. And I wrote this back in November, and that's where we are right now. Now, of course, we had a very big inflation number in December because of what we call corrective inflation. They were letting prices go, so you're going to get this big inflation force to get relative prices where they're supposed to be. So that was completely expected, but they can dollarize. And only condition I think that they couldn't do it is if the IMF decided not to support them, and they've announced that they're going to support them. I don't see why they wouldn't. So the IMF was looking for roles, an actual singular role, and this is a good one for it. So, I'm fairly optimistic on that front. Getting prices right will help a lot. but there's quite a bit of adjustment to do. So that's mainly just, it's arithmetic. It's not even a forecast. It's taking the number, solving for the exchange rate that makes the liabilities of the central bank, the monetary liabilities of the central bank, and that includes bonds like LALIQ and LEBAC, equal to the amount of foreign exchange reserves. And it's about 831. And now they're already there, right? So their monetary liabilities are fully backed already by their dollar reserve. The question is politics, I guess. I think Christina Kirchner, when they were still, her husband was the president, they put a bill through Congress that gives the president a very strong, not dictatorial, but executive order. In Brazil, you have a thing called medida provisória, which is a temporary decree, and it has to be voted on, and it has to be passed by Congress. These things that they do only have to be overturned. They're limited in scope, but there's a lot of stuff they've been doing without having to deal with Congress. Certainly, mathematically, they can dominate. And yes, Milei's coalition is his party is very small, his representation. His coalition, just like everywhere where you have the coalition politics kind of morphs, and he's running into some problems with some of his omnibus bill to get all this stuff done, especially on the labor side. But they're moving in the right direction. And just a little bit going back to what happened in convertibility, and a couple people, Steve Hanke, a couple other folks have written about this. Steve Hanke is a very big currency board guy. He advised Argentina in the first one, and I'm sure he's certainly talking to them, I suspect. But right now, Argentine assets are extremely cheap. So you look at housing, look in some of the better Recoleta, some of the better neighborhoods in Buenos Aires, and you convert at the current exchange rate to dollars, it's very cheap. These apartments used to compete with Milan and New York and London. Yeah. You look at Bariloche. So I was, talking to my wife, who's Brazilian. He's like, "Do we buy something?" And an economist friend of mine, he said, because you got to make sure about your exit. And of course, that's the first thing you do as an investor. When you're going in somewhere, you got to know how you're going to get out. So we haven't, the plans are to liberalize, and it hasn't all happened yet. So I'm going to wait a little bit, but maybe I'll buy something in Argentina. But the moral of the story here is, first, you have a lot of Argentines that have assets offshore. Yeah. Huge amounts. All you need to do is accumulate the errors and omissions in the current account. And also the current account is another way you can get, the exporters, they still hide stuff abroad, even though they're trying to force them to bring it back. So there's lots of assets abroad. So that's what happened in 1991, 1992. You had a lot of Argentine and companies repatriating. There's companies that were starved for working capital and investment funds. A lot of investment projects are on hold because they can't bring the dollars in. So you're going to get a big inflow of dollars. And we've already started to see it. The other thing is, when you look at the dynamics of the exchange rate, most people think that, the black market rate is going to be the equilibrium, but that's not the case. We've seen this. I've seen this so many times. Tells you I'm old. But what happens is when you have a constrained market, you create a black market. And if it's constrained, the natural supply isn't there. So it's constrained at a quantity below the equilibrium. And that means the black market's going to trade at the demand curve, way up on the demand curve. So if you liberalize, then the black market rate should come down. And that happened the first 2 weeks. And then as the official rate goes up, and then they converge. And they're converging. It's still a lot of uncertainty. People are still very worried. Okay, and the things they're putting in place, I think, are quite constructive.
So if I understand correctly, then you're saying the country's balance sheet or finances are already in a position to dollarize. Yes. So what's next is a matter of the political process to actually make the dollar legal tender. One of the most popular talking points for Milei in his campaign was that he was going to abolish the central bank. Can they dollarize without a central bank?
Yes. Hong Kong doesn't have a central bank. Ecuador doesn't have a central bank anymore, effectively. The central bank, that was the original idea, is to convert the central bank into purely a lender of last resort. But of course, they put lots of restrictions because the lender of last resort can compromise the exchange rate regime, which it ultimately did later. People say, it didn't work because of the trade. No, it didn't work because the government, under duality, et cetera, decided they wanted to borrow a lot of money to spend. And so they diluted the quality of the dollar assets by sticking in Argentine government dollar denominated assets and selling the actual U.S. treasuries and so forth. So the true backing went down and the amount of monetary base creation was quite high. And that's what undid it. Plus, the government came in and decapitalized the banking system through the pacification process. So, the thing is, do they have the willingness to stick to it? And what really is amazing is Ecuador, right? Doesn't seem like there's any push to go off the dollar. And at the time, Rafael Correa he ran his campaign for presidency on de-dollarizing, and he didn't do it.
Yeah, I saw a stat the other day that relative to a minimum wage salary, Ecuador has the cheapest housing market per square meter in Latin America. It's dollarized. So who would have thought that the cheapest real estate is dollar based in Latin America?
It's also shown that if you have a credible fixed exchange rate regime, relative prices will change, as we saw during the gold exchange standard, et cetera, until the Great Depression. And it's still arguable why everyone went off gold in the Great Depression. They wanted to use the exchange rate to stimulate it. But it works if they want to do it. The conditions under it working, however, are quite constrained. You have to have serious fiscal prudence. You have to run large primary surpluses. You have to be able to finance a good portion of the interest on it. And then you have to hope that you can roll over debt coming due. And typically that goes along with dollarization. The credibility of the system is quite high. Also, this was pointed out by another paper that I read, and this is right. You don't have a lot of dollars to dollarize. If you dollarize the assets and liabilities of the banks, you don't need dollars. Then that's how when they when Brazil did some, similar to the Bonex plan, they did the Collor plan, but they took a haircut on the assets and the liabilities. So the banks were okay, unlike in the pacification side. So they can convert their assets and liabilities to be denominated in dollars. And then the question is, what will people do? I think, we've seen many times this exercise, not that many times, 4 times, where people, confidence grows and people bring their money back.
Yep.
And that's the bet that Milei is making. But again, the fiscal side is all important and people have to believe it. And then finally in Argentina, and this is true in all Latin American countries, except perhaps what's mostly Colombia, Brazil, and Argentina, the provinces have always been sort of this weak Achilles heel. Cavallo forced adjustment on them after the convertibility. They balked, they forced him out of office, and then they started cheating on the thing. So we saw that during the Kirchner's administration and the Fernandez administration. Same thing happened in Brazil. I mean, we had these sort of serial defaulters in the states. Cardoso administration put institutionalized adjustment on the states. And then later administration started chipping away and we're seeing that same thing now in Brazil. So these are the things that, again, the same themes in Argentina. And they also have to redo the pension system that was invaded by the Kirchner. So, which all is on the board, but they're doing it at breakneck speed. And it's kind of a lot to handle in such a short period of time. So far it looks like it's going. There's definitely going to be bumps in the road, like the labor courts. That's definitely going to happen. So
cautiously optimistic, I guess.
Yeah.
Great. So
and the assets, I'm optimistic about the assets for sure.
About equities as well. You think the market does okay?
I never looked at the Argentine equity market. Just sort of the big like YPF, et cetera. I never was a stock picker, but. A lot of Latin American countries have equity markets that don't reflect the economies.
For sure.
Even the big ones. I leave that to the stock, but we discuss stuff. We talk about things like that, but I usually don't make my own call on individual stocks.
Okay.
You probably do that, right?
I do, but I don't know what to do with an Argentine balance sheet in a hyperinflating currency. I just don't know how to value it. So I haven't picked a stock in Argentina.
Well, that they arbitrage the ADRs, right? That's how you basically get this blue exchange rate. Because JP Morgan, we have the ADR in New York trading in dollars, and then they have the assets on Argentina in pesos.
Yep.
So you can buy the equity, deposit it, and then shift into an ADR and sell it.
Right.
So they make that market, and that's really the real sort of black market rate. But Argentina had like 15 exchange rates. They actually had dollar Qatar, they had dollar Coldplay.
Yeah, I was in Argentina in November of 23. I was there when they won the World Cup. And there was a Coldplay exchange rate. It was chaos. The prices would adjust every 3 or 4 days. There were rations at the grocery store in Mendoza. It was right. It was bad.
So you could buy at a subsidized rate, tickets for Coldplay.
The black market rate, my chorizo steak was $3. It was incredible value if you had dollars, but a sad situation.
The question is if you can get it in. But yes,
Argentina. What about getting it out though? Because one of the big criticisms I hear too, especially because I follow the mining companies, and there's huge deposits in Western Argentina, but no one wants to make the investment. Not necessarily because they don't think they can develop the project economically. It's because then the profits are stuck in Argentina and they don't want to reinvest.
it goes both ways. Things with perspective. I used to talk to a lot of mining companies as well when I was at CIBC.
Mm-hmm.
And when they came to me to ask me what they could do, they were actually trying to get money in because they got approval for imports, but not approval to buy dollars. But you're absolutely, then there's restrictions on outflows.
Yeah.
And, my understanding is that they're going to liberalize that. It's the only way you're going to attract new money is if you allow people to leave. Right. So that's an entry barrier is an exit barrier. An exit barrier is an entry barrier. Right. So, and that's, God, I've been doing this for 30 years or something, and it's always the case.
Okay, so let's move to Brazil then. It's where you've lived. I've lived there over a decade now. So I'm really interested to hear what you think's going on in Brazil, because I get the widest dispersion of opinions, right? The people completely pessimistic because of the new government and everything to, macro bulls thinking the Bovespa is about to do 25-30% this year. So what's your, the general state of the Brazilian economy in your opinion?
Well, there's only 3 times in my career that I was negative about Brazil. This is one of them.
Okay.
First, when the Collor plan was put into place back in 1990. The second was starting in about 2010, because the policies that the government at that point put in place were poor. They were done slowly, but it's sort of like, that story about cooking the frog.
Mm-hmm.
It sort of started hitting the fan in 2013, and then ultimately in 2016. 2013 to 16, Brazil had its worst recession in history. And this time, basically, I think people that are bullish on this government thought that Lula would come in like he did in 2002. At the time, he was deathly afraid of the market. He made an equivalency between markets and the military. It could overthrow him. And he was very, very conservative. Ultra conservative. He increased the primary surplus target. He warned the state governors to not default because when there was a couple defaults by states when Cardoso was president, and they used the contracts that they had lent them money that they could sequester flows to the Caixa Econômica. He said, not only am I going to do that, this was after they put the fiscal responsibility. This is Palocci, the finance minister, was put in place. So we're going to also prosecute you in civil court because you violated. So he came in and did ultra austere, ultra classical, I guess, neoliberal policy when he came. And he got everybody's confidence. So by the time, and it worked extremely well, it got him reelected 4 years later. Then came the crisis. So he already started moving back to all the things that the PT has talked about, more state-owned lending, more intervention in markets, redoing the concession contracts, getting rid of fiscal austerity. And then they created this sovereign wealth fund, which made no sense. You create a sovereign wealth fund when you have a surplus. Brazil didn't have a surplus. They funded the fund with issuing government debt, which
they levered it. They
was investing it because it was so.
Yeah,
not the greatest idea. And then they did the private-public partnerships. And then they started abusing some of their state companies and the banks I won't go into everyone knows about, even though they're trying to rewrite history on that thing. But
the old Banco Itaù.
Yeah, exactly.
Right. Yeah.
I mean, the things they controlled gasoline prices way below the international rate. So Petrobras accumulated an $85 billion hole. They did that in a number of other places as well, like electricity, et cetera. The whole public sector was careening to a crash, and it did crash. So, and then they used the banded ass to lend at below market rates because it was being decapitalized because they weren't getting the return high enough to cover their cost of capital. Every time they got decapitalized, the government gave them more government bonds. And so this is how they sort of hid, it's called pedaladas, hid their primary expenditure expansion. And they're trying to do that again. There's some laws in place now that make it very difficult to do that.
Yeah.
And so what's he doing now? Well, he's doing all the same things. It was actually Dilma that put a lot of it. It started with Lula, and he's putting it all back in place. He first kept gasoline and diesel prices way below the international rate. It was clearly creating problems. Just all we have to do is go to the bottom line.
But does he have the same political will or the same ability to put everything back in place that he did his first term? Is he as effective this time?
He has more will and less ability.
Exactly. So are these is it going to be as bad as the last time, even if he gets everything he wants?
It may get as bad, but it's not going to be as extended. It'll be fast, right?
Right. It'll be a crisis.
He's basically got the pedal to the metal, in my view. So if we look back to 2022, the peak in the primary surplus, that is the fiscal balance without interest included, was in September, August, excuse me, not 1.9% of GDP. That was after a big COVID generated deficit. We don't have the numbers for December yet. We have the numbers for the central government, but my projection is certainly going to be well above 2% deficit. So you've had a swing of more than 4 percentage points of GDP in 6 months in terms of the primary balance.
And that's all the government change, right? So the previous surplus was due to the policies of the Bolsonaro government, and now the deficit is the delta between what Lula's been able to accomplish and what he wants to do.
Well, actually, it was done before he took office because the incumbent had no power. So through Congress, they negotiated with the incoming administration this transition bill. It was actually a constitutional amendment. And the expansion in expenditure was 4% of GDP. It was massive. And then he didn't like the fiscal responsibility. He didn't like the spending ceiling, which was really a good rule. It was strong. They made it flexible. We're in the pandemic. You had to make it flexible. That's a contingent problem. And then they went back to it, which is exactly what you want in a fiscal rule. You want some flexibility when things are bad, but you want the government always trying to get back to where they were before, and they did. What he did is this thing where you basically have this sliding target. It's very sophisticated and not strong. And it amounts to the dynamics. Many economists have done simulation. I did one, but then these other guys, Marcos Mendes and Marcos Lisboa, did some. They did it for me. I didn't have to do it anymore. But it's basically they're going to overspend. They're going to miss their target, and what they have to do by this law is find more taxes, and that's what they're doing right now. They're running behind this with taxes. They're promising zero primary deficit next year. Like, that's good. You have to have a surplus to pay some of your interest, but they're not going to make it. And, it's clear that they had overestimated inflation. So that means they overestimated receipts, which happens a lot. And even the Tribunal of Accounts has said that the budget doesn't add up. So, but the dynamic of this fiscal rule is basically spend more, tax more, spend more, tax more, and lend more.
So brings me to the recent tax reform, right? They recently did some reform, and now they have the highest VAT tax in the world. So where are the additional taxes going to come from? It's already a high tax country.
It's that they actually gauged that to be neutral. Okay, before, the value added taxes were collected at each stage, not at the final stage, and you had an accumulated tax burden to the consumer. So the consumer ended up paying the whole thing, but it was charged intermittently as part of the cost of inputs. This just goes to the end. So the idea, it's a high percentage rate, but that's what Brazilians were paying already. Implicitly, even higher, actually. Brazil's tax burden. And now it's much simpler. Companies are not going to have to sit around hiring accountants, do all this stuff all the time. And it's going to be much simpler. So it may end up generating more tax revenue because it's more efficient. As you said, yes, as a value-added tax correctly implemented, it's a very high rate. But the problem with the discussion over the years, when I did my dissertation research in 85, 86, there was the first bill of tax reform put in Congress. And it never seemed like we were ever going to get one. But this is a good one. There's some problems. They're giving some benefits to some people that probably should, tax breaks that they probably shouldn't, like restaurants, for example. But it's a good one. And we're going to have some commentary later today about this on a thing that I'm doing today. So we'll see what they have to say. But my father was an accountant. That's why I moved to Brazil. He worked for Arthur Andersen. I hate accounting, so I flee from it as much as I can. But I do it when I have to do it. So to my view, to my understanding of tax and the best experts that I've listened to in Brazil, it looks like a very good reform. So this was, of course, conjured up in the prior government, but it's been in the works. Bernardo Appi's worked through. He's the main guy behind this thing. He's worked for a number of administrations, and it's a good one. And that's a good one. And what it'll do, if it becomes more efficient, if we get prudent fiscal policy, they can actually probably think about lowering taxes in the future. The biggest problem has been the tax base of the states. The tax base before, the only value-added tax was taxed for the states. And so getting a negotiation where all the states would agree to something was always almost impossible. Income taxes are low, so no one wants to change that at the federal level. So, and then you have a value-added tax at the federal level called the industrial production tax. What they did was they create, they're going to attack, federal government's going to collect the tax. They're going to split it into two. One goes to the states, part of it goes to the states, and part of it goes to the federal government. What the political sort of snarl was, it's going to be this thing is these funds are going to be run by a board, joint board, and that might become politicized in some way. So that is a bit of a problem. But I think those that were pushing the reform that are very hawkish in terms of fiscal policy, especially in terms of tax policy, agreed to it. So the best I can discern on this thing and what I've heard and seen and read and fiddled around with numbers, it looks pretty good to me.
So going back to the new rule on the deficit and how they have to fund it, if it can only come from increased taxes, so they can't borrow, right? They can't issue new debt to fund the deficit. Is that correct?
Well, they have to issue new debt. So there's no ceiling on the debt anymore.
Is that part of this? That's part of the new rule.
Golden rule that's still there, but it's not binding.
Okay, so if they need to raise debt, they'll raise debt.
Yeah, and debt to GDP ratio is rising very, very quickly.
So one of the counterpoints then that I've heard to the rule and the primary deficit being a huge problem is Brazil's agro industry. So 10 years ago, Brazil wasn't as globally relevant as an agricultural commodities export. Today, they might be the most important agricultural commodities exporter in the world. So, and that's a huge portion of their trade surplus, right? I think without agro, they run a trade deficit. So is the agro industry, can a bull market in agro commodities save Brazil and patch over all these problems?
That's sort of been the assumption, but Brazil agriculture in terms of it being important in the world has been important for a very long time. Mm-hmm. Especially with the advance of soybeans. So soybeans, Brazil 20 years ago was the third largest producer of soybeans now, and then they were second. Now they're actually the first, and they are the biggest provider of all agricultural commodities to the world. But that is actually an outcome. They liberalized and got rid of subsidies in agriculture. It used to be there were credit subsidies there, especially during the inflation. If you had access to this subsidized credit, it was great. You just take, if you weren't making much money growing stuff, it didn't lead to any new investment. All it did was change the liability structure of the companies. So they put it in the market, make some money, on the overnight market. So they really opened agriculture. And you've had open investment. Over the years, you've had big presence of ag industry in Brazil, like Caterpillar, et cetera. They've been there a long time. And you've seen this catapult forward in terms of productivity. It's not as big a part of the economy as might expect, at least just contained. It's bigger than that everywhere else. And commodities are also not as big. Here's the thing. I don't look at trade balances. I do, but most people think, commodity prices fall, Brazil's current account's going to go into a big deficit.
Exactly.
And I remember hearing this when I was the chief economist at Itaú. I said, no, that's not the case. 80% of Brazil's exports, or 60% of their exports are related to commodities. But 40% of their imports are related to commodities, especially fertilizer. So when those prices went down, Brazil gained, net terms of trade got worse, but nothing like the people that made projections on the real using purely and simply commodity prices, we had this ridiculously high dollar. And then what happened next was really amazing. After the 2008 crisis, you started to get recovery. When I was at Itaú, I used to talk to a lot of the fertilizer companies, and all the farmers had bought going into the crisis, the 2008 crisis. Brazil was booming again agriculturally. They bought a ton of fertilizer on term. And then suddenly they put it all back to the companies. So they were literally sitting on piles of fertilizer, kind of a nice image, right? But that was true worldwide. It wasn't just Brazil. What was interesting later, when you got the recovery, food prices recovered, right? Because those are perishables. Fertilizer is a capital good, or at least a semi-capital good, right? So you had this massive increase in food prices, but no increase in fertilizer prices. And that drove Brazil's terms of trade way up. And that's why the real became so strong. It's just a huge, the terms of trade determines the Brazilian's real exchange rate. And then how you get there's two ways to get to that exchange rate, right? Either through inflation or through the nominal rate. And it's been a pretty good predictor. Now, something happened during the last 3 years before this fiscal expansion. When you do a fiscal expansion, that tends to appreciate your currency in real terms as well. So before 2021, I have a series going back to 1978. The terms of trade dominated movements in the real exchange rate. However, the terms of trade recovered after COVID quite a bit, and the dollar stayed high. And the only way you can explain that is fiscal austerity, because like when you expand fiscally, you appreciate the currency, unless people are panicking. That's a different story. But when you expand the fiscal side, it appreciates the real currency. And that's, I still sort of had a trade on, I sell dollars above 5. It's still got a trend downwards. The government keeps keeping it high with the noise that's going on. But yeah, there's a trend for this to go down, and at least for a while. Now, when you get other things happening, it'll get a little bit dodgy. But the fiscal side, even though it's deteriorated, is still okay, at least for the exchange rate.
Interesting. So what else are you focusing on in Brazil?
That's pretty much it on the economic side.
What do you make of the central bank? Because I thought it was really interesting that I thought it was really interesting that there were calls maybe, I don't know, 2 years ago for Jay Powell to resign. Biden was getting, and that happened right when Lula came in, right? They were talking about, is he going to take over the central bank? What's going to happen? It's going to lose its independence. Now, when I talked to Heraldo de Paula not long ago, he was worried that there's a board and that Lula was going to be able to one by one, and by 2025, he would have 11 of 12 votes, and then the central bank head would be symbolic. Is that a risk?
Yes, it's definitely a risk. And at the end of this year, Roberto Campos Neto's term ends. And they put Galípolo there. He doesn't really know much about monetary policy. He's a decent academic economist. But the fear is that he'll be the president, and then we're going to go back to sort of not such independent monetary policy. To my mind, Roberto Campos Neto has been the very best central banker, and his team, the whole central bank, in the world.
Yep. Since COVID,
they may have over-loosened during COVID, but he quickly corrected that. He was the first one. They were the first ones to start tightening. They probably, in my view, they over-tightened a little bit, but not threatening growth, just that they didn't have to go that high. And now they're easing. And Brazil's growth did not get suffered by those high interest rates. Brazil's growth has been robust. It's hard to pick out the rubber band effect from the real stuff, but the growth has been quite strong. And, and inflation came down within the band. Now it's picking back up again after the recent loosening. So it ended a little bit outside the top of the band, which is 4.5%, and ended at 4.62. But so far, really extraordinary, really, really great. And that's because they've legislated an independent central bank for the first time, a statutory one. And that is paid off. I mean, Lula owes a debt of gratitude to that and to Roberto Campos Neto, not the other way around. But he tried to change it. Yep. He tried, and Congress said, he went to Congress, and Arthur Lira said, we did all this work to get an independent central bank, the head of the House, the Speaker of the House. We're not going to throw it in the trash can just because you were elected. So you sit, and some of the policies are getting resistance from Lula. So that was one of them. That was the really important. He also tried to change the concessions that in infrastructure that Tarcísio de Freitas, as planning minister, had done. Congress said, no, we're going to keep them the way they are. We're getting good investment. And so it really is a political thing. How much will Congress resist? And Brazil is like pure coalition politics.
Yep.
So if you have the budget, but you're seeing these points of resistance, the lines in the sand kind of thing, which is encouraging to me. That's why I'm still positive medium term. But I think the outcome of this is going to be not so great by the end of last year. And it's showing up already in the data. You have huge fall in investment, an even bigger fall in foreign investment, 40% decline in foreign investment last year. So, and I root for Brazil. There's no doubt about it. But this is the same thing that I saw back when it was 2010. You got to be careful on the street. You can't be negative too early, right? Because the cost of carrier shorting stuff costs way too much. But so I had to time it a little bit. And then when they finally get compensated, you want to come back in big time. And that was 2016. So same kind of thing. And we're going to see the same dynamic here.
Interesting. Yeah, I talked to a macro analyst recently, and he looked at the share issuance for the equity ETFs. And he said what he saw by the new issuance and money coming in is foreign money left Brazil for COVID, and it never came back. And it still hasn't come back.
Yeah, you see money going into the Bovespa, but you see more Brazilian money going out.
Yep.
So wife's uncle is a broker at a bank down there. He always sends me the flows. And I said, yeah, but the Brazilians are going the other way.
Yeah, right.
Back and forth, right? When it gets cheap, it's hot money. It's fast trade. Brazilians are good at fast trading. It's not a long time investment.
I guess there's another tax, I guess, that reminds me to ask you about. Lula recently implemented a tax on offshore funds for the investment industry for corporates, right? So what does that mean necessarily?
I have not looked at that carefully.
Okay.
I think it's almost unimplementable.
I do too, but I think he did it, right? I mean, I think the idea is right, because a lot of these, they call it the Cayman sandwich, right? They'll open a Cayman structure, they'll open a Delaware C Corp, and then essentially they can do, no capital gains tax if you're a hedge fund in Brazil. And I think he's trying to tax that, but I don't know how he forces them to repatriate the capital.
Yeah, it's like here in the United States, the idea of taxing unrealized capital gains. Huh? Was he going to give me money back when I have unrealized losses? It doesn't make any sense, but they've implemented something. I have not looked at the details of that part, but maybe.
Okay. Yeah, I think that might be part of the reason the investment community is so up in arms about, as they're
even if you don't know the details, any kind of thing like that is going to scare investors away.
right.
Now, the multinational thing, you've had a big drop in foreign investment. Well,
Right.
And you've had a drop in imports. They go hand in hand because what happens is when companies are expanding, multinational expanding, they change the accounting a little bit so you don't have as big an incentive to do this. But they'll declare profits and dividends. They used to have a ceiling on how much you could repatriate. So it was a 25% of original capital invested. So what they want to do is get that original capital invested up. So they remit it and then bring it back as FDI, and then they buy machinery. So it sort of hit the current account 2 times, it hit the capital account once. And when it undoes, you see a huge shrinking of the current account. So a company's trying to get money out, they stop remitting profits and dividends. It's not coming back in as foreign direct investment, and then it's not being imports don't go up. So remittances go down and imports go down. You get the double whammy on the current account, and you still see that behavior.
I'll ask you specifically about American companies then. Are American corporations as relevant in Brazil as they used to be, say, 10, 20 years ago? There's a headline that sticks out. There was a Ford plant, I think in Bahia, and they closed the plant. Ford abandoned it. And a week later, a Chinese electric car manufacturer came in and the plant's up and running as a Chinese factory. Is that the trend, or is that just
Well, for the automobile industry, they basically wanted subsidies back. Before. Brazil has had an automobile industry for over 100 years. The effective rate of protection is over 70%. The amount of subsidies in that sector.
When you say effective rate of protection,
well, if you import, they gave priority import tariffs on imports. So you have to look at the whole protection of the burden
car. For a Ford company is 70% for foreign production.
Yeah,
the premium.
It's 70% in the price of the car.
Yep. Okay. Yeah, it's crazy. If you look at some of the American cars that
protection, you have to bring in all the input outputs. I'm sorry.
Sorry, I go late over. I was going to say, I think most people would be shocked to look at the sticker price for some imported American cars. Like a Jeep Renegade that goes for $40,000 in the U.S. could be $150,000 in Brazil.
Well, when I moved there in 2008, I thought, well, let me see how much it would cost to import my car. I would have had to pay 150% of the price that I already paid for. So I said, no, sorry. And it would take a long time, so I'm not going to do that. So, yeah, if you can't grow out of infancy in 100 years, then I think it's time for Brazil to liberalize. There's no reason for Brazilians to pay that type of premium for cars. I mean, when I bought a car there that was at least 30% more than you would pay in the United States, even in dollars.
I see it all the time. Brazilians say, "O carro popular não existe mais." It's like an everyman's car doesn't exist in Brazil anymore. Because even the cheapest, the Golf, it can be.
Yeah, it's extraordinarily expensive, and there's no reason for it to be there. I mean, there's no reason to be subsidizing. Well, who's left there? Mercedes,
Volkswagen.
And
you get inferior cars, right? They don't make quality cars relative to what you get in the
they're
US.
very good. That part is true.
Yeah,
they're good, and they developed a lot of technology.
The flex fuel,
the flex technology, et cetera. At first, they were, when I lived there as a kid, not good, and then they got even worse as you got to the end of the 70s. It was sort of like rice paper. They were very flimsy.
I remember.
But then because they went to ethanol, 100% ethanol. To be able to get that car to move, it had to be lighter. Now the flex technology is extraordinary.
Yeah, it's like 40 million cars that run on it too. It's a huge fleet,
and the quality of the cars is good. Quality is good.
I remember driving with a friend in like 2011 or 12. We go over a speed bump and he bangs it. It makes a terrible noise. And I go, "What is that?" And he goes, "Oh, my engine hit the speed bump." And I go, "What do you mean?" He goes, "There's a part that goes under and protects your engine underneath it. But with my cost an extra 10,000 reais to put it on, so I bought my car without it." That's crazy. But
yeah, I haven't heard of that one. That's a new one. But I moved back in 2009. So
okay. What about the American investment in general? Is Americans leaving Brazil a trend you see, or no? Is there still, it's just other industries?
It's not like a company getting up and leaving. Ford got up and left because they didn't get the subsidies and they weren't going to be viable. So they left, right? But in the 1990s, during the 1980s, during the debt crisis, they just depreciated their capital stock. And then some did leave. And the companies that kept a toehold in Brazil, like Texas Instruments, they reaped the benefit when Brazil finally stable. So multinationals have a very long horizon. They can manage for a long time. They just don't do any CapEx. So they just depreciate their capital stock. They make current revenue and minimize their interest costs. I don't think Brazil's going to be going to anything any near what we saw in the 1980s. But looks like there's a little bit of that going on.
What do you think, the foreign companies, American companies get wrong when they decide to invest in Brazil for the first time? Because, when I was studying FGV, and I still see it all the time, they would talk about all these failed entrants by foreign companies in the market, right? Like Walmart's a famous. Yeah, well, Walmart's a famous one because they sold golf clubs and baseball bats at their first store in Brazil, and no one in Brazil golfs or plays baseball. So they thought they were just going to take their inventory from the U.S. and implement it in Brazil was going to work. But what do you think are some of the common mistakes?
You didn't answer part of your other question that, a lot of the companies worldwide are no longer purely American because our tax system had pushed a lot of them out of having their headquarters in the United States. Then with the tax cuts, they came back. But I know the banking side more.
Okay.
And if you're a bank and you're going into Brazil, you need to know exactly what you want to do. Exactly. Not, I'm going to get in there and make a presence. No, all the banks that did that have left. Even when they opened up the market, it was at first, because they had a very restricted chartering process because they had a banking failure crisis in the late 1960s. So they basically said no more banking charters, and they basically cut off any new entrant. So you had to buy another bank to do it. But you had, who's left of the foreigners? Santander is there. They bought a big state bank, Banespa. HSBC came back in, but they got rid of their commercial. Bank of America is there.
JP Morgan, not retail's there.
Yeah, that would be the Chase side. Chase was a commercial side, was a retail side.
Yeah.
Citibank is not there anymore.
Closed everything.
Which was Brazil was a big deal for them.
Yep.
So the thing is, you have to know exactly, because Brazilian banks are very good. They're very competitive, even with restrictions. There's a lot of restrictions, but you can see there's a reason why Brazil is so far ahead of everybody on fintech, because they had to cash checks quickly. During the inflationary times, if you let something float in the market where somebody can, earn 20% a month, that's money. The banks made a lot of money on that, but when they had to pay something, they immediately. So even in the 80s, if suddenly I have short cash somewhere, I could do a cheque especial in, less than 2 hours. So the ability of them to clear checks and so forth, because the inflation was very fast. And then you go forward, at my position at the Brazilian American Chamber, I had a lot of U.S. fintechs coming in. We want to go into Brazil. And I said, well, that Brazil's kind of ahead of us.
Yeah, I see.
And this, they have open banking, and I have, on my app, on my phone, I can lend money to people and stuff like that, and I can invest.
I have that too. I see payment companies that want to enter Brazil, and I go, "What are you going to do better than Pix?"
Yeah, no, Pix.
We don't know. It's instant, immediate, and it's free. So, what are the Brazilians going to need you for?
There's suspicions of the ability to get it hacked. I guess there was a case, things like that.
Pix?
But I think that's true for everybody, right? So.
Yeah.
No, and that was Roberto Campos Neto. I wrote my dissertation about his grandfather's reforms, which were the capital market reforms of the 1960s. And he's really taken up that mantle. He really wants to make finance and banking accessible to everyone, even less well-to-do and so forth. So he is called Roberto Campos' grandson, right? So he's taken up that mantle for sure. And so far, so good. I'm not sure about, cryptocurrencies. I don't know. I don't invest stuff I don't understand. I give lectures on cryptocurrency, but they've taken that on as well.
Yeah, if you ever want to talk about that, feel free to ping me. I spent 5 years full time at Brazil's cryptocurrency industry. In 2017, I was at Foxbit. We were doing like 40% of the Bitcoin volume in Brazil. And then I spent 2 years at Mercado Bitcoin, and it's crazy to see. I mean, the user numbers are real. And if you're looking for a public market proxy, you can follow Nubank. They're probably going to win the next crypto cycle. They have like 1.5 million monthly active clients on their crypto product. So it's there. Brazilians like it. I guess intuitively, Brazilians tend to understand currency risk. So if you tell them, hey, it's inflation.
They like volatility.
That too.
But, I do it from an economic, not an investing point of view. I do it from, it's an asset. Okay. What does it bring more than gold? Don't know. But I look at it, is it a coin? No, it's not money. It's, so
I thought Bitcoin's the only one I'd ever recommend or talk about. It's digital gold. It's a proxy for it digitally. Right. So it's more portable. Like I'm not going to travel with $1 million in gold on an airplane, but you can do it with a seed phrase in your head. You can cross a border. It's like anything. There's no right or wrong in economics, only trade-offs, to quote Thomas Sowell. So it's gold with different trade-offs, I think.
Yeah. Well, there's certainly a lot of markets created because of transaction costs that are redundant. So like CDS. CDS is redundant to the repo market. And that's how CDS traders were hedging themselves. You have a lot of redundancy in foreign exchange. So
the IOF tax on foreign exchange used to be 6% in Brazil. Like it's no wonder people tried to use Bitcoin instead. Like I can keep 6% of my money.
Yep.
Right. All you have to do is just send the remittance in Bitcoin. You sell it on the other side immediately. So I don't know. There's volatility, but on 10 minutes, there's not that much, right? So
yeah. Brazilians at one point were the country that had bought the most Bitcoin in the world, right? Do they still have that person?
No, they just don't. It's just not rich enough, right? Compared to, a couple guys in Silicon Valley can buy more than the Brazilian exchanges. But there's, I think 8 million registered accounts the last time I looked in Brazil, and they're really there. I mean, I've seen the accounts. It's diverse. So you'll get a 60-year-old bus driver in Salvador, or a 20-year-old student in the south of Brazil. It's a real market.
No, there's, going back to my vision of how Brazil is going to go, I mean, Brazil is big.
Yeah.
So implementing a government like in Venezuela, Argentina, can't do, and even Argentina, the press was free and they didn't allow a lot of stuff to happen.
Yeah.
And I just, I also think Brazilians on the whole are conservatives.
It's polarized, right? Yeah, there's no 50% of the country wants one thing, the other 50 wants the other, so ittle be stuck in the middle.
The overall goals, their preferences, you're talking about political candidates. I'm talking about what they want out of life. It's all the same. So want low inflation, honest politicians, decent growth, a decent job. There's really nothing more than that. Yep. And that's what brings Brazil back every time. And it did, in the 90s, and it did it again recently, and I suspect that's going to happen. And we're seeing it in Congress and so forth. So I'm optimistic long term on Brazil because of Brazilians.
I make that argument all the time. People don't get it, but I think the human capital, the untapped human capital there is enormous. And one of the reasons I liked working with Bitcoin so much, but back to the trend you talked about with financial inclusion, there's 50, 60 million unbanked Brazilians, which is an economy, it's a top 10 population country in the world, right? And as soon as you get them on, you see this financial market deepening, right? So Brazil's 2 steps forward, 1 step back. They'll have economic growth over 10 years. And as they do, there'll be more investors coming into the Bovespa, right? I mean, the Bovespa still only has like 3.8 million accounts in Brazil. Yeah. Now, it's not beneficial owners, but it's still very small. Like equity hasn't even caught on yet in Brazil.
We think the same. Absolutely. Wow. And the other thing is Brazil has a leg up on all the other countries in Latin America pretty much because of their corporate governance reforms since the ones that Roberto Campos put in place in the 60s. You have the equity market, even though it's not completely representative of the economy, is an extension of the market for managers. Brazil was the first country to have a hostile takeover. They did close the firm later, but still, you have a very dynamic market for managers in Brazil, and they're getting, you have a number of very good business schools, and many of Brazilians have gotten their MBAs and PhDs abroad. So you have, a pretty good core there, and you also have a regulatory infrastructure. It still needs to get a little better, but that type sort of popular capitalism, you don't see anywhere else in Latin America. You're starting to see signs of it, but nothing like Brazil. You're right, it's still small.
It's still small, but compared to the rest of Latin America too, I think there's Sao Paulo for financial markets, and there's not really a close second, right? I mean, Mexico City maybe, but you start going looking for a job as an investment analyst in Bogota or Santiago, and there's not very many options. But Sao Paulo, you'll find a job. Like, you can show up in Sao Paulo and you probably find a job in finance if you look hard enough.
Absolutely. So it's anyway. Shall we want to move to Mexico? We'll talk about, are we done with Brazil?
We can be done. We can be done with Brazil. I'm happy to talk about Mexico if you got time. I want to be respectful of your time. We've already gone an hour here. If you want to save Mexico as the election gets closer, it's fine with me too.
That's, I'm not a political scientist, but since I've been in this market so long, and as an economist, you have to do. I always thought AMLO's secret goal was to recreate the old PRI and put himself back in. His candidate, Talman, is well ahead of everybody else. And she's not Claudia Sheinbaum is not a particularly strong candidate. And unlike AMLO's predecessors, he's leaving office very popular. So the old PRI used to be, or they went to more participatory Congress, et cetera. That really happened under Cedillo. The outgoing president would name the successor, and just by default, they'd win. And AMLO was part of that treaty. He's in what is called a dinosaur. And that seems like he's at least what he set up. Now, if she loses, he may try, he's already put some Supreme Court justice, he may try to stay on. And I think that's quite dangerous. I don't think Mexicans will accept that. But he is very popular. And that's the danger on the political side. He's, in terms of economic policy, he's great on the macro and not so good on the micro.
Yeah.
He is a fiscal conservative. That shows you how important fiscal policy is to how well these countries do. He is a fiscal conservative, and that has carried, and Mexico's growing very nicely. He tried to do a little bit in the central bank. He appointed a new governor, but still the central bank has done its job. Inflation is down to 4 something. And, the economic side is doing well. He hasn't messed around with trade. He hasn't messed, a little bit, he agreed to some of the sort of protectionism that the United States put into place. But, the things that I think that Mexico should do that aren't happening. He then, on the micro side. So the micro side, he wanted to make, Pemex great again. It doesn't seem to be working out all that well. And then the other thing that Mexico has that nobody else has, except for some very small countries in Latin America, is 2 coasts. And my view, I wrote an essay when I was at HSBC, whoever comes in should be concentrating not on north-south trade per se, but east-west.
Yeah.
So, and, you have ports in Juarez, et cetera, in the Baja California, but they're woefully inadequate for what they could do.
Right. When you look at a country like Chile and how relevant they are exporting to China.
Right.
And said, why couldn't
and Brazil to Europe. I mean, they're Brazil and Chile combined. Yep. But they constantly are looking north-south. And I worked on NAFTA. That was, NAFTA helped the north-south thing. It was before that, Mexico was hurting with this trade in the United States because it took more to get a good from Mexico City to the border than to get, a shipment from Taiwan to the west coast of Mexico.
Interesting.
Yes, it was. And the maquilas were a way around that, but still, they were starting to compete with Asian maquilas, and it didn't work out. It was not going very well. And they've improved the infrastructure north-south. We have also all sorts of weird regulations that some of them have been repealed, but some of them have not. Like, they didn't allow Mexican trucks to go in. That was part of NAFTA. That was violated early on. And they did this really weird thing. They would, ship stuff to they do by train to Veracruz. They put them on ships to then ship the stuff to Houston. It's like, that makes no sense at all. So if I were, covering Mexico as closely as I used to, but that to my mind, from a long-term policy stance, it seems to me that would be great if they do that. But I don't see any.
Well, what do you make of what do you make of the nearshoring narrative then? Because I understand that as more north-south, right? It's American manufacturing coming back to go back into the U.S. Is that an American trend where they're bringing their stuff to Mexico, or is that something Mexico is actively importing that they want?
No, that's an American trend.
Okay.
I heard that from others in Florida, especially. Yeah. So they didn't want to have, to go all the way over to India for stuff and things like that. It's sort of
does make more sense.
A little bit of a gimmicky name, but it just means you're going to go to the Caribbean or Mexico or something close, for Latin America. Which always
kind of struck me it always surprised me that you'd see so much manufacturing in Asia and Vietnam when you can do it in Ecuador or Mexico or Colombia.
And that requires reform and investment in infrastructure, or giving concessions that allow for good investment by the companies in infrastructure. And for some reason but I do think Mexico is a good place for nearshoring. Is it going to create a massive boom? I don't know. I mean, it's just a question of having more rational production lines, as far as I can guess. And, especially, and also services. Services, you can do a lot of services more closely instead of, engineering, banking, et cetera, as opposed to, you get on the phone. At one bank I worked at, you get somebody in Hong Kong on the other line. Yeah. And they were okay, but it's that kind of stuff I think is probably more propitious to something closer.
Yeah, the time zone makes a big difference, and culturally, it just U.S. culture has much more in common with Mexico, Brazil, Latin American culture than it does with Asian culture, I think.
So we had reshoring, onshoring, offshoring, and then we have
nearshoring.
Nearshoring. Yeah.
So last question I'll ask you about Mexico then is I saw a lot of funny posts of Americans that had bought a house in Mexico during COVID for retirement. And then all of a sudden the peso got really strong and they're like, oh my God, this is way more expensive to live here than I thought it was going to be. So what has led to the peso's strength over the past, say, 2 years?
Well, it's, the economic growth has been pretty good. The barriers to entry for dollars not very stringent, right? So that creates an inflow. And also, you've had good macro policy, especially monetary policy. They are still, the policy rate's still at 11 and a quarter. Their inflation rate's 4.5. That's going to help the currency a little bit. And so we've had pretty austere policy across the board. And the fiscal side is keeping, it's not massively austere, but it is austere enough to keep, the fiscal accounts. No one worries about Mexico defaulting. No one worries about anything along those lines. So that part, Amo's done an extremely good job. And he's, when he was mayor of Mexico City, he was very conservative. He also has a great minister of finance, Rogelio Ramírez de la O. And he was his treasury secretary in Mexico City. And Rogelio, kept him in line. Rogelio's really great. Very good policymaker.
Interesting. John, thank you so much for doing this. This was a wonderful conversation. Where can viewers follow your work, follow you, stay in touch, give them a send off?
Anytime you want.
Okay. Well, I will link your company in the show notes. So if anyone's interested, they can reach out to you.
Thanks I'm working on my website still. It's going to have a vast improvement soon. It's pretty not so good right now.
Well, let me know when it's ready. I'll tweet it out for you.
Very good. Thank you very much.
Thanks, John.